Richard Dreyfuss concealed the true cause of his most startling public collapse for half a century. In May of 2024, he stood before an audience in Massachusetts and made statements that sent families from the theater. Everyone was certain they understood his explosion. They were mistaken. He has finally spoken up about what made him so furious that night, and he is 77 years old now. A phone call started it all 3 days ago. He received a message from an old acquaintance. Following their explanation, everything shifted. The breakdown was not caused by politics. It dealt with deceit. On October 29, 1947, he was born. However, his tale began far earlier than that. Norman, who was his father, had spent his formative years in a rough area of Brooklyn. In order to survive, one had to be tough in that environment. Despite Norman's success as a lawyer and cafe owner over the years, he could never shake the ghosts of his past. More than only a Brooklyn connection ran through the family tree. Last but not least, Richard found out that rebel Hessia Hoffman, who murdered Tsar Alexander II in 1881, was his great-grandmother. Among her companions, she was the sole survivor. Dreyfuss wasn't the only one who resorted to violence, though. There were also killers in Russia and street brawls in New York. You may find it in his pedigree. For his mother Geraldine, it was the opposite way around. She had escaped the kind of anarchy from which her husband had sprung and had spent her life fighting for peace. The hardships Norman endured were not the only reason he was tough. The wounds inflicted by a mortar strike during the World War II Battle of the Bulge will never fully heal. The army had provided him with shoes and walking sticks, which he used for the remainder of his life. From an early age, Richard's complicated past and his will to progress influenced him. It showed itself in his later performances as well. Average men struggling emotionally and breaking down when pressured. This was no spectacle. Near that brink, he had spent his childhood. When he was just 9 years old, everything changed. At that age, most boys were either playing in trees or out on motorcycles. However, Richard had his heart set on a career in acting. He knew he would be, even if it was something he hoped would never happen. They eventually had to leave New York because his dad despised it. Their journey began in Queens, ended in Los Angeles, after which they traveled through Europe. However, the excursion was far from ideal. All members of Norman's family were fleeing their troubled history. There in the thick of everything was Richard, who refused to give up on his ambition. He transferred to Beverly Hills High School after traveling to several cities. At the Art Center at Temple Emmanuel and later at the West Side Jewish Community Center, he began performing with the assistance of drama instructor Bill Miller. The majority of children remained well-behaved. Even though Richard was constantly on the go, his enthusiasm never waned. When he was 18 years old, the Vietnam War had enlisted all of his friends and acquaintances. However, Richard displayed boldness. A conscientious objector, he claimed. He stayed out of the conflict and spent 2 years assisting people in a Los Angeles hospital as the world around him crumbled. It happened in the years 1965 to 1967. He spent the day at the hospital. He would search for acting jobs late at night. His television credits include guest appearances on Bewitched, Peyton Place, Gidget, and Room 222, among others. He had been a student at San Fernando Valley State College for a year. However, performing acting gigs and working at the hospital soon became more important. He wasn't armed, and there weren't any demonstrations happening. Lastly, he chose to work at the theater at night while quietly serving throughout the day. Working quietly, he was gaining his footing in the world. He made his stage debut in 1964 at the tender age of 15. Yet, his first paying gig was on the show In Mama's House. He had previously been on Peyton Place. Grades are a source of anxiety for many adolescents. Richard had begun working earlier. Even at home, not everyone was pleased. Because the war had shattered his own ambitions and left him scarred, his father did not support his son's professional endeavors. It finally snapped under the strain. At the age of 21, Richard was the one who Norm abandoned. No was the last thing they said when Norman passed away. Despite Richard's early success, he remained silent. His family was falling apart, and he became famous at the same time. Through all of this, he was changing his acting style. At the Jewish Community Center, he took improv classes where he learned to live in a scene and react without a script, rather than the more traditional approaches. Over the next few years, he gained recognition for his raw, genuine manner. His first film role was in The Graduate, released in 1967, when he said the brief phrase, "Should I call the police? I'll get the cops." But the movie made $104 million. $9 million at the box office. That's about $857 million now. At the time, almost no one paid attention to him, but millions of people saw the first movie scene of someone who would win an Oscar less than 10 years later. He was 19 years old and an extra in a scene set in a boarding house. Director Mike Nichols had no idea that he was shooting the actor who would go on to star in Jaws and Close Encounters. He got his first lead part the next year in The Young Runaways, which almost ended everything. The movie was terrible. Dreyfuss was only 20, but they made him play a hippie draft dodger who was 32 years old and said strange things like, "I'm all hung up in my own hassles, baby." Critics tore it apart, claiming that the acting, the music, the writing, and even the story were all flawed, that the speech didn't even sound like it was from real people in the 1960s, and that the author, a 51-year-old man, obviously didn't understand what young people are like. For Dreyfuss, it was a harsh lesson, but for some, it became a popular joke. It's not always a good idea to be in charge. Things started to change in 1973, when everyone was interested in the violent and twitchy role he played in Dillinger, Babyface Nelson. He did more than just look the part. He studied actual FBI files and discovered that the man who had killed more agents than anyone else in history was only 5 feet 4 inches tall and had a voracious appetite. Dreyfuss portrayed Nelson as a murderer with no remorse. I was terrified. Even though Dreyfuss only made $25,000 and the budget was a meager $1.5 million, his performance was outstanding. Jaws was soon beckoning to Spielberg after he took note. The following year, in 1974, Dreyfuss delved even farther into the narrative of a Jewish youngster attempting to flee the impoverished Jewish ghetto of Montreal. He could relate to the protagonist's struggle for a better future because his ancestors had emigrated from Hungary and Austria. Studios felt the book was too racially charged for readers, so they shelved it for more than 15 years. However, when the film was released, Dreyfuss poured his heart and soul into it. Pauline Kael was very effusive in her praise, and he was also given $50,000. It depicted the anti-Semitism prevalent in Montreal in the 1940s and caught the intense desire of a young child who was determined to achieve his dreams. This part demonstrated his ability to bring weighty plays back to their foundations, which he had hitherto lacked. Next, American Graffiti emerged. George Lucas first laid eyes on Julia Roberts in an unaired pilot for Happy Days. Because of that, he was cast as Kurt Henderson. The film was shot in 28 nights in Paloma on a shoestring budget of $777,000 following the revocation of a filming permission by another town. In addition to Dreyfuss's $25,000, the film made $140 million globally. The character he played, which involved pursuing an enigmatic blonde in a white Thunderbird, was reminiscent of Lucas's own experiences as a teenager in Modesto. Before test screenings wowed viewers, Universal planned to bury the film. However, they quickly pushed Happy Days to TV in an effort to ride the wave. Dreyfuss had assumed the role of the group's contemplative member, debating whether to depart for college or remain put. People all throughout the world could relate to the job. Playing the role of the astute marine researcher Matt Hooper in the 1975 film Jaws transformed Richard Dreyfuss's life. Becoming famous wasn't his initial objective. The harrowing ordeal that was filming on Martha's Vineyard from May 1974 through October 1974 was nothing short of a nightmare. Spielberg had to conceal the monster more than reveal it since the mechanical sharks were malfunctioning, which intensified the movie's dread. Particularly chilling was the moment involving Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw, in which Shaw delivered a monologue concerning the USS Indianapolis. It went down in cinematic history as a watershed moment. Later on, though, Dreyfuss said that Jaws was dull and that he doesn't enjoy discussing the film or the subject matter in general. Regardless, the film was a financial smash, topping the box office until Star Wars debuted 2 years later. Dreyfuss starred in another Spielberg film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, in 1977, 2 years after that. A regular guy whose life unravels after witnessing an unusual UFO, he performed the role of Roy Neary. The film, which Spielberg began developing in 1973, grossed more than $300 million globally. As the man's loved ones abandoned him, Dreyfuss had to portray his mental breakdown by having him construct a massive replica of Devil's Tower in his living room. It was tragic, not spectacular, that situation. Spielberg went so far as to suggest that, in the film, we could learn to communicate with aliens, which could lead to a breakthrough in our Cold War negotiations with the Soviet Union. The film further elevated Dreyfuss's star in the entertainment industry. It was in the same year that his love tale stunned the world once again. Dreyfuss portrayed the role of Elliot Garfield, a poor actor who lived with a woman and her daughter in Herbert Ross's and Neil Simon's The Goodbye Girl. The part was a huge success because it was genuine, hilarious, and sweet. When he won the Oscar for Best Actor in 1978, he was the youngest guy to do it, aged only 31. Impressively, for a romantic comedy, the picture grossed over $100 million. Not only was he beloved by fans for his role in Jaws, but he was also able to effortlessly blend comedy and romance with his endearing vulnerability. Dreyfuss decided on a completely different project in 1978, while still enjoying the popularity of The Goodbye Girl. He portrayed Moses Wine, a private detective entangled in the radical politics of the 1960s who was involved in the case in The Big Fix. There was more to it than meets the eye. On a personal level, Dreyfuss was able to channel his personal political activism into the film. While it failed to garner much attention at the box office, it demonstrated his versatility and courage in standing up for his principles. In 1980, the competition followed. But here's the rub. When Dreyfuss received the part, he had no idea how to play the piano at all, despite his prodigious talent. Thus, he trained for 2 months continuously, clocking in 4 hours each day. He was instructed by the producers to execute each key stroke and movement with precision while playing the piano. The film depicted the extreme lengths to which Julia Roberts would go in order to fully immerse herself in a part and brought the audience into the realm of high-stakes classical performance. One scenario was an actress who dropped her wine glass on a grand piano, causing the piano instructor to scream in agony. With 1981's Whose Life Is It Anyway, he took it to a whole new level. There he discussed euthanasia, a highly contentious issue at the time, while playing the role of a crippled artist. The film delves into the question of whether patients have the right to choose death over life, as his character expresses a desire to live independently of technology. According to critics, he managed to find humor in the midst of terrible anguish, and the film prompted serious discussions about whether patients or doctors should have ultimate authority over their own deaths. In 1986, following a period of relative peace, Dreyfuss made a triumphant return with Down and Out in Beverly Hills. In Disney's inaugural R-rated feature under the Touchstone banner, he co-starred with Bette Midler and Nick Nolte. Audiences adored the spontaneous and wildly entertaining comedy. On a budget of under $14 million, the film went on to earn nearly $60 million, making it the top-grossing film of all time. His public battles with drug addiction made this comeback all the more remarkable. The next year, in Tin Men, he portrayed B.B. Babowski, a 1960s aluminum siding salesman who gets into a gunfight with Danny DeVito's character following a small vehicle accident. What begins as a harmless rivalry escalates into a full-scale war, complete with the pursuit of each other's spouses. It had a biting wit and biting edge, but it also hit closer to home. 2 wounded guys who were losing life and striving to win at something. They may have discovered some of themselves despite having lost their licenses and jobs by the end. The 1989 remake of Spielberg's 1943 picture always brought him back together with the director. Spielberg finally got around to making this film after years of wanting to, but he announced his divorce that same year, so it came out at a difficult time. The film dealt with themes of love, death, and letting go, and Dreyfuss embodied all of those themes. However, behind the scenes, Spielberg and Dreyfuss were still having issues and weren't getting along as well as they had before. Just as eventful was Dreyfuss's private life. 10 days after meeting Jeremy Rain at a party in 1983, they were married. In the same year, Emily was born, and in 1986, Benjamin came along. But there was a strangeness. Murray once tossed a hefty ashtray at Dreyfuss while screaming in his face that everyone despised him. It vanishingly missed. It was the most moving moment of Dreyfuss's life, he claimed. Harry was born in 1990, the year the marriage collapsed, and by 1995, Jeremy had taken the kids and departed. Domestic tensions weren't the only ones. The set of Bob and What's Up, Bob? Dreyfuss and Bill Murray had an altercation in 1991. A heavy ashtray was hurled at him by Murray after he informed him that everyone despised him. Murray smashed their producer's sunglasses and hurled her into a lake. According to Dreyfuss, Murray was a pig and an inebriated bully. He kept mum about the film for a long time, but in 2020 he hinted that he might pen a letter to himself and finally put it behind him. Dreyfuss earned $100,000 every episode in 2001's The Education of Max Bickford, in which he played a professor sobering up from alcoholism. However, the program struggled. The show tackled controversial topics including transgender characters and academic politics, and it was shot entirely in high definition. The sitcom was canceled after only one season due to poor ratings, which led CBS to fire 2 producers within a month. Then, in 2008, he portrayed the role of Dick Cheney in W, a political film directed by Oliver Stone. Tensions rose to an all-time high when Stone's preferred actor, Robert Duvall, was replaced by Richard Dreyfuss. Dreyfuss stunned everyone when she backed Cheney and placed the blame on the American people for their silence regarding Bush. Making slightly under $30 million on a budget of $25 million, the film was a complete failure. Unexpectedly, he performed his own stunts in the 2010 action film Red, playing the role of armaments dealer Alexander Dunning alongside Bruce Willis and Helen Mirren. He was 63 years old at the time. Despite suffering multiple injuries during his 3 months of training, he refused to allow a stunt double perform in his stead. Not only did it receive a Golden Globe nomination, but it also earned $199 million. He proved that older actors can still be the center of attention, even though the part was written for someone in their 40s. As Bernie Madoff, he appeared in the 2016 ABC miniseries Madoff. He went on a 15-pound diet and colored his hair silver to get ready. Actual victims of Madoff who did not want their stories dramatized threatened him with death. The reviewers, however, held him in high esteem. Instead of excusing the villain, he humanized him, which made him more real. Then, in 2019, at the age of 72, he played the lead role of an astronaut who is an old guy with a lifelong ambition to travel to space. He struggled with despair and aging, and the picture reflected it. His long battle with bipolar disorder was finally brought to light by him. Over the course of a single day, filming took place in the bitter Canadian winter. Though it failed to garner much attention, it provided him with a serene moment of serenity, a man who is both timeless and full of ambition. After riding the coattails of his breakout roles in Jaws and Close Encounters, Richard Dreyfuss was once a global superstar. However, a perilous change had occurred by 1982. That was the year he crashed his Mercedes-Benz 450 SL into a palm tree in Benedict Canyon after passing out behind the wheel. A seatbelt that he couldn't recall buckling had him dangling precariously when he regained consciousness. He was apprehended by the police after they discovered Percodan and cocaine in the debris. That, however, was not the only matter that troubled him. A tiny girl with pink frock and horn-rimmed glasses kept appearing in his dreams for a long time. Even at wild gatherings, she would appear out of nowhere, and he couldn't help but be terrified of her. His last day of drug use was November 19, 1982. He continued to wear glasses with horn frames a year later, on the exact same day that his daughter was born. Whether she was the girl he spared that night or the ghost that appeared to warn him, Dreyfuss claims he is unsure. On the other hand, Dreyfuss fought more than simply himself. After receiving $870,000 from his father and uncle in 2012 for an alleged family emergency, he took them to court to demand repayment. Despite Dreyfuss paying for about a third of the sale, they utilized the funds to purchase a 13-story building in downtown Los Angeles without informing him. He was allegedly just 10% owner, and he was not even paid $1 from the $5.5 million judgment they received in 2009. He had previously sued them in 2008, so this wasn't his first rodeo. Most people were startled that Dreyfuss, despite his stardom, was still involved in a familial betrayal. The year 2024 saw the rise of a different type of tension. At a Jaws screening in Massachusetts, Dreyfuss made some hurtful remarks on transgender rights, which caused a lot of people to exit the cinema. Simultaneously, his son Ben took to Twitter to call out an unacceptable behavior within the family. Despite Ben's hasty denial, the scene revealed something more profound. He and his dad had their differences, but he always supported him. Family feuds in the modern day unfolded in real time on Twitter. Dreyfuss took a whole different path in 2008, before all of that. After coming clean about his lack of knowledge about government when he was a kid, he launched a civics education initiative. In his pursuit of a robust civics program, he even spent 4 years in Oxford. Students in Texas launched lunchtime groups named the Sons and Daughters of Liberty to test out his program, which centered on narratives and community conversations. Dreyfuss made it crystal obvious that regret, not politics, was at stake. This effort was his attempt to rectify his decades-long neglect of public life. The sense of conflict, however, originates far earlier, in the 1975 film Jaws. Richard Dreyfuss, according to Robert Shaw, was an impulsive youth without any prior acting experience. Shaw made his life a living misery by slamming him, criticizing his acting, and even daring him to climb the boat's mast for $50. Spielberg compared Shaw to a possessed man, and Roy Scheider recalled that Shaw had the opinion that Dreyfuss deserved a slap in the face. The on-screen tension between their characters was heightened by the authenticity of their tension. While filming W in 2008, the identical incident occurred again, but this time involving Oliver Stone. Although he played Dick Cheney on screen, Dreyfuss was constantly at odds with Stone off-screen. Dreyfuss likened the ordeal to her time spent working with Sean Hannity and went on to accuse Stone of being a fascist. To top it all off, he came clean and said he was only in it for the money. In response, Stone said that Dreyfuss needed cue cards because he couldn't recall his lines. Reminding Stone that she was bitter since she didn't receive any Oscar recognition, Dreyfuss brought up the subject again in 2014. Year 2017 followed. Writer Jessica Teich came forward with accusations of harassment against actor Richard Dreyfuss as the #MeToo movement gained momentum. Teich said that Dreyfuss had exposed himself to her in his trailer in 1987, among other incidents. Despite his denials, Dreyfuss did confess to engaging in sexually suggestive behavior that he believed was reciprocated. A misunderstanding, he said. The fact that he had tweeted in favor of his son Harry, who had accused 18-year-old Kevin Spacey of grabbing him, further compounded the situation. The hypocrisy was exposed by the critics. Things continued to go wrong. During her May 2023 appearance on PBS, Dreyfuss went ballistic over the new diversity guidelines implemented by the Academy. He claimed he wanted to throw up at the thought of being told how to cast a movie. Why do modern actors feel pressured to play to society's sentiments? He defended past blackface performances. He had already expressed his belief, spoken only a few months prior, that he would never be able to portray a black man. It looked like he dug his heels in further with each interview. Dreyfuss swayed to Taylor Swift's music as he stepped onto the stage at a Jaws event in Massachusetts on May 25, 2024, wearing a floral house dress over his shirt. A number of people described his performance as a hate speech as he removed his dress while singing, held up his cane like a bat, and began to yell. In addition to mocking the LGBTQ+ community and survivors of sexual assault, he targeted transgender youth. Some families departed, and one mother mentioned that her daughter, who was 10 years old, sobbed while the speaker was speaking. The theater sent an email of apology the following day, but 3 days later, they held what guests characterized as a night of homophobia and sexism instead of an event aimed at combating prejudice. There was no way the two were more different. Ben Dreyfuss found himself in the center of it all once more. While acknowledging the family's embarrassment, he attempted to explain his dad's actions without justifying them, utilizing social media to defuse the situation. He made a public statement out of his tweets, and that statement became news. The consequences were too great for even their allegiance to avoid this time. His representative was swamped with cancellations instead of setting up shows because so many venues called off his performances. Dreyfuss felt increasingly isolated as the days stretched into months. All the scandals he was a part of, involving blackface, the Oscars, Stone, Jaws, and more, added up. Then, in July of 2025, Dreyfuss's shocking hospitalization with viral bronchitis surprised fans. He was forced to postpone an unusual public appearance at Florida's SharkCon. Wrapped in a Jaws blanket, he lay in bed, frail and clumsy, as shown in a film. It wasn't until his wife brought it up that he recalled being ill. The beeping machines and the weary eyes. Seeing him again after more than a year had been a first for many. Something appeared to be amiss.